Señoras y señores, a continuación y seguidamente escucharemos al señor Stephen Aplin, experto canadiense en energía nuclear y medio ambiente. Disertará sobre el cambio climático, energía nuclear y seguridad energética. El señor Stephen Aplin, Vicepresidente de Energía y Medio Ambiente en HDP Group Inc., Canadá. Especialista y consultor en energía y medio ambiente, director de la ONG ecologista Canadian Energy Initiatives. Señoras y señores, presentamos entonces al señor Stephen Aplin.
Thank you. It's nice to be here. It's nice to see so many people still here listening to this interesting discussion. I'm really happy to see so many people interested in this issue because it's an extremely important one. All the discussions that we've heard so far are in the context of a fundamental question, which is how should we make electricity? How should we make more electricity in this country, in Argentina? There are some people, first of all, you probably know the side that I am on. I think that there should be more nuclear power. That shouldn't be a secret to anybody. But I understand that there are people in the audience, or there may be people in the audience who don't agree with that. I'm happy that you're here. I'm happy that you've stayed this long, and I hope to at least convince you to have a different look at nuclear technology. In many respects, we're discussing the same issue right now that was being discussed when electricity first came to this country, which was probably about 100 years ago. It was 100 years ago in most countries around the world, and they were having the exact same discussion in many respects that we're having today. Of course, they weren't discussing nuclear energy because nuclear didn't exist then, but they had a number of very narrow options for bringing electricity to the country, and those options, when it comes to making electricity, were using hydropower or coal or oil. When they were discussing the ways to build these plants, they were narrowed down. They were looking at just those options for a reason. They needed to be able to provide millions of people with electricity 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So this is why they only were able to look at hydroelectricity or coal or oil, because there were machines that could make electricity 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in sufficient quantities to be able to supply society. Every country in the world that electrified, which was about 100 years ago, including my country, Canada, Argentina, the United States, Western Europe, every country that electrified did it with one of those three technologies, or a mix of those three technologies. You notice that in that time, when the first wave of electrification around the world, a very important thing to remember is that nobody used wind power. This is not because they were unaware of wind, or that they were unaware of the technologies that used wind to make electricity. It was because they couldn't serve society 24 hours a day, 7 days a week using wind, because wind doesn't blow all the time. In the mid-20th century, or around the second two-thirds of the 20th century, there was another debate, exactly like the one that we're having today, about how to provide more electricity, because societies had grown, economies had grown. And just like in the first wave of electrification, they also did not choose wind. But in this next wave, they did choose nuclear, because nuclear is capable, just like coal and oil and natural gas and hydropower, of providing large amounts of power 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And again, they did not choose wind power. And that was for the exact same reason that they didn't choose it the first time, because it hadn't changed its characteristics in the 50 years. It hadn't started to blow more. It was as unreliable as it was at the beginning of the century, and it was not suitable to provide to society. Now, as I mentioned off the top, we're having the same debate that they had 100 years ago, that they had 50 years ago, and that is, how do we provide more electricity to more people? And there's another criterion now that is on the agenda, and that is climate change. This new energy that we have to provide to expand the supply has to be low carbon or zero carbon. At the second, or the climate summit that Federico was talking about in his talk, and you've got unprecedented public awareness of climate change, of carbon-related climate change driving the agenda, and that is why we need to make now that is low or zero carbon. So at this climate summit that just happened in New York just a couple of weeks ago, the three major things that came out of it were we have to keep temperatures at 2 degrees. We have to limit the temperature rise to 2 degrees. Another highlight of the summit was we have to put a price on carbon, and we have to increase the money that we're paying developing countries to put in clean energy. And they refer to it as clean energy. When they're talking about clean energy, they're talking about primarily wind and solar. Now, one of the things that they said in order to keep the temperature, to limit the temperature rise to 2 degrees, one of the ways to keep it at 2 degrees is to limit the emissions by 2020 to 6 billion tons. We have to cut 6 billion tons of carbon out of the global emissions. If you look at the graph there, that's the trend of carbon emissions since the Industrial Revolution. If you look at the last 50 years, it's skyrocketing. So the international leaders have said that the very upper part of that graph, we're supposed to stop that upward trend by 2020. And they're supposed to do this by using wind and solar, which have proven to not provide electricity in the first and second waves of electrification that occurred around the world. Now, is wind and solar going to help us reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 6 billion tons by 2020? Federico was talking in his talk about Germany, and I'm going to talk again about Germany because Germany is an excellent example. Germany is doing exactly what world leaders say we should do. So Germany's been doing this for 14 years. They didn't just start. The Energiewende is a relatively new word that's come out, but they've been supporting renewable energy for the last 14 years. That they're putting, let's just look at what their record is in terms of what they've achieved with their renewable energy policy. Every year, German power plants put 325 million tons of CO2, carbon dioxide, into the air. And let's have a look at how things have looked since 1973. Can you go to the next slide? Yes. As you can...
Yeah. Oh, you have
to move it down. This line here is the amount of fossil energy that they're using to make power. This line is their nuclear output. Germany has nuclear plants, and they started to phase them out in around 2011, and you can see what happened to nuclear output. And these bars here, the blue bars, are the amount of CO2, carbon dioxide, that German power plants have put in the air every year since 1973. Look at the trend. It basically hasn't changed. It's gone inched up in the last little while. So the answer, can we reduce carbon emissions by 2020 by even 6 billion tons, which I regard as a small target? That answer is clearly no, based on what Germany's been doing. Now, you may have heard a lot of praise for Germany in the world media. The reason why Germany has failed to reduce emissions is because they have gone with the wrong technologies. They've used technologies that the early electricity planners knew wouldn't supply enough energy to a grid. And in order to make the electricity that society needs, they're providing it with coal-powered electricity. So clearly, renewable energy in the form of wind and solar, and I would remind people that outside, in this auditorium right now, the air conditioning, the lights, the presentation, all the microphones are not running on solar power. There's one technology if you want to increase your power supply, your electricity supply, and not add carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. That one technology is nuclear. I'll give my home jurisdiction, my home province of Ontario as an example. In the year 2000, our electricity sector carbon emissions were 40 million tons. 13 years after that, 13 years later, 2013, last year, those emissions were less than 13 million tons. That's an emission reduction, an annual emission reduction of 27 million tons. Ontario is actually now one of the cleanest electricity jurisdictions in the whole world. Just about 3 hours ago in my province, this is a measure of how clean it is. Each kilowatt hour of electricity from the Ontario grid, each kilowatt hour of electrical energy off the Ontario grid came with about 28 grams of carbon dioxide. And in Germany, that amount would be about 500 grams per kilowatt hour. And as a result, we're one of the cleanest electricity jurisdictions in the world. And not only that, we have provided ample, sufficient power to our citizens. How do we compare with other jurisdictions? Let's have a look. This might be hard to look at. This graph might be hard to follow. But electricity carbon is on this side. As it goes up, carbon goes up. As you can see, the circles get bigger. So you've got jurisdictions like the United Kingdom here, where per kilowatt hour it's putting out 470 grams, and it costs about $13 or 13 American cents per kilowatt hour, versus Germany over here, about 468 grams, about as dirty as the UK, but it costs nearly 3 times as much as the UK. The yellow zone in that graph is jurisdictions like Ontario that have very clean and very affordable power. So you've got France, Finland, Switzerland, Sweden, and Ontario. And look where Germany and Denmark are. Their power is not clean, and it's expensive. Why is it? It's dirty because they use lots of coal to make electricity. And it's expensive because they have a lot of wind power, which is expensive. So I would ask again, are they models that we should follow in order to reduce emissions by 6 billion tons by 2020? This is not, this analysis that I've done to arrive at these numbers was from publicly available information. So it's not a secret. It wasn't hard for me to find this information. And I think that I'm not the only one who knows this. So why is it that we have world leaders at a climate summit saying that we need to use more renewable energy when obviously renewable energy doesn't work and can't work? So I asked the question, why is it that everybody is recommending a solution that's clearly not going to work? And when we've got, can you go back to that graph again? When we've got evidence of what does work, all of those jurisdictions in the yellow box are very heavily nuclearized jurisdictions. So we know what works, and we know what doesn't work. Why are we not adopting a technology that clearly reduces carbon? And that is because the same world leaders that are urging us to get into wind and solar are afraid of getting into nuclear power. They're afraid of getting into nuclear power because they know that there is a public perception against it. And this is because there are a number of myths, a number of falsehoods about nuclear power. And that's what I want to close up my talk with tonight. There are 4 main myths about nuclear power. They relate to safety. Second is cost. The third is waste, nuclear waste. And the fourth is proliferation, weapons proliferation. People think that you can make bombs if you have a nuclear reactor that is making electricity. Now, on the issue of safety, I want to mention an example that is very, that pertains to what you're debating here in Formosa. I understand that the debate is over whether to build a uranium processing plant or refining plant. I understand that there are people who are nervous or afraid about the implications of having a plant that deals in this material. I just want to say, I'm from Toronto, Canada, Toronto, Ontario, the capital of Ontario. In Toronto's a city of maybe 4 to 5 million people. It's a densely populated city by Canadian standards, maybe not by South American standards, but by Canadian standards, it's a densely populated city. Right in downtown Toronto, in a residential neighborhood, there's a plant that is very similar to the one that is being proposed here. This plant makes fuel for nuclear reactors. It uses the same material that will be refined, or that would be refined if the plant goes ahead here in Formosa. It uses almost exactly the same material. I want to emphasize that this is in a downtown Toronto neighborhood. Right. And it is run by General Electric, and it is run for literally decades. The people in the neighborhood recently found out that this plant had actually been operating there. So people were very surprised, and some people were very worried when they found out that this uranium plant that makes the fuel for our nuclear reactors is right in their neighborhood. So they had many meetings, such as the one that we're having here tonight, and they asked the Federal Nuclear Regulatory Authority to do studies of the environment around the plant and to see whether the plant might be endangering anybody. The Nuclear Regulatory did an exhaustive study and recently released its report, and I was not surprised by the results, which said that the plant does not pose a threat to anybody. Dr. Roth and Dr. Gonzalez here might understand why it is that that's the case, because the materials that are in this plant are not sufficiently radioactive to cause any harm. As I said, the plant has been there for decades. Most people just found out about it, and it really is it's just a place where people go and work and they make a very safe fuel. If there are questions afterwards and people are interested in other aspects of nuclear safety, I'd be happy to answer them, but I'll just finish off this part of my talk, which is just about finished. I just want to, if you could put up your hands if you've heard the word Fukushima, okay? How many people here have heard the word Chernobyl? I thought so. How many people have heard the word Banqiao? Nobody. Banqiao was a major hydroelectric disaster that occurred in China in the 1970s. Something in the order of 26,000 people were killed, and hundreds of thousands lost their homes. We know all about Chernobyl. 56 people were killed at Chernobyl. It was a tragedy. But we don't know anything about Banqiao, in which literally thousands of times of people were killed. Every technology has its risks, but if you look at risks objectively, nuclear is the safest of the major power generating technology. The issue of nuclear safety is a big one. I don't want to look like I'm glossing it over, so I'll be happy to, if you've got questions at the end, to discuss more aspects of it. But I want to move on to the issue of cost. So in terms of cost, I'll use the Ontario example again. Nuclear power in Ontario costs about 45 Argentine pesos per kilowatt hour. Wind energy, because we've got wind energy as well, wind energy costs 300 Argentine pesos. So the household retail price of electricity in France, 128 Argentine pesos. In Germany, it's 249 Argentine pesos. France makes most of its electricity with nuclear reactors. Germany is phasing out nuclear power. And in terms of carbon emissions, Germany puts out 6 times the carbon emissions that France does from electricity. On the issue of nuclear waste, which is another area of great exaggeration, you saw the soccer stadium, or not the soccer stadium, it was a tennis stadium that Dr. Roth showed. Well, one of those holds about a third of what a natural gas-fired plant would put out in carbon dioxide every day. The Ontario nuclear fleet has been running for 40 years, and all the waste that it has generated would fill the bottom part of that stadium up to about here on me. Federico was showing in his presentation the size of a uranium fuel pellet and the equivalent amount of energy that is held by coal, if you recall that. That same analogy works in the area of waste. You use literally a million times less material to make electricity, and you have a million times less. So the issue of waste, of nuclear waste, and the idea that we don't know what to do about it is false. Now I want to move on to the issue of nuclear proliferation. I'm just about done my talk, so thank you for your patience. People say that if you build a nuclear reactor, that you'll make material that can make a nuclear bomb. That's a nuclear electric power generating reactor, I should be clear. None of the countries that have nuclear weapons, there are 9 countries in the world today that have nuclear weapons. the United States, Russia, the United Kingdom, France, China. All of these countries developed their weapons from secret military programs. Almost all of them have nuclear weapons because they stole nuclear weapons secrets from the first country that made nuclear weapons, which was the United States. None of them got their nuclear materials from a civilian nuclear reactor. There are excellent technical reasons for this that I don't want to go into because it's very complex. But there is no connection between civilian nuclear power and military weapons. These 4 nuclear myths that I've discussed are why we're not using nuclear power across the world to fight climate change. They're false reasons, as I hope that I've demonstrated, and like I said, I'll be happy to discuss this later, but they're repeated with such emphasis and with such passion by people who oppose the technology that politicians take them seriously. And I hope to convince you that the climate change war that we're fighting outweighs a lot of these falsehoods, and that we have to take a new look at these falsehoods and see whether we should take them seriously. And that's it. That's my talk. Thank you very much for staying. Thank you very much for giving your attention. And thank you, Federico, and everybody here for having me as a guest.